April 1st, 1950, 2:47 a.m., Highway 49, North Carolina. Dr. Charles Drew's Buick sedan drifted across the center line. He'd been driving for 7 hours straight, heading to a medical conference at Tuskegee Institute. Exhaustion had finally overwhelmed him. The car left the road at 65 miles per hour. When the vehicle stopped rolling, Drew was trapped in the wreckage with catastrophic injuries. Crushed chest, severe internal bleeding. The kind of trauma that required immediate blood transfusion to have any chance of survival. 3 other passengers, all doctors, all black, were injured but conscious. One of them, Dr. John Ford, crawled from the wreck and flagged down a passing motorist. Within 20 minutes, they'd reached Alamance General Hospital in Burlington, North Carolina. The hospital had blood. It had surgeons. It had everything needed to save Charles Drew's life. Except one thing. It didn't admit black patients. What happened in the next 45 minutes would become one of the most bitter ironies in medical history. Because Charles Drew wasn't just any patient. He was the man who'd invented the blood bank system that saved millions of lives during World War II. He was the doctor who'd proven that blood plasma could be stored long-term and transported safely. He was the surgeon who'd trained thousands of doctors in transfusion techniques. And he was dying from blood loss while a hospital full of the blood he'd made possible refused him treatment. The legend says they turned him away at the door, that white doctor refused to touch him, that he bled to death in a colored-only waiting room, while pints of blood stored using his techniques in facilities he'd designed, administered through protocols he'd established, sat unused in white-only wards. The truth is more complicated, and somehow worse, because what actually happened reveals not just individual racism, but systemic failure so profound that the man who'd revolutionized blood medicine couldn't benefit from his own invention. This is the story of Dr. Charles Drew, the surgeon whose genius saved millions of lives, whose work made modern medicine possible, and who died in a segregated healthcare system that valued the color of his skin more than the content of his achievement. This is the story of how America took blood, the most fundamental symbol of shared humanity, and segregated it by race. This is the story of the man who proved blood was blood, regardless of who donated it, and the nation that refused to believe him. To understand what Charles Drew accomplished, you have to understand the problem he solved. In 1938, blood transfusion was a procedure that killed almost as many patients as it saved. The science was understood. Transfer blood from a healthy donor to an injured patient, and you could treat trauma, surgery complications, and hemorrhage. The problem was logistics. Whole blood couldn't be stored. It degraded within hours. Attempts to preserve it with refrigeration or chemical additives failed. The blood cells broke down, became toxic, killed patients faster than the original injury. This meant every transfusion required a living donor on site. Hospitals maintained donor panels, lists of people who could be called in for emergencies. But matching blood types, coordinating schedules, and hoping the donor would show up in time made transfusion unreliable and dangerous. Surgeons hated it. They'd successfully operate on a patient, then watch them die from blood loss because no compatible donor was available. Trauma doctors couldn't treat accident victims because by the time they found donors, the patient was dead.
Blood medicine was a nightmare of timing, luck, and frequent failure. Then, in 1938, a 34-year-old black surgeon named Charles Drew started thinking about plasma.
Drew had been born in Washington, D.C. in 1904. His father was a carpet layer. His mother was a teacher. They were middle class by black American standards, which meant they struggled constantly with racism that limited opportunities regardless of ability. Charles was brilliant, athletic, driven. He won a scholarship to Amherst College, one of the few institutions that admitted black students. He excelled in athletics and academics, then faced the reality that black Americans with college degrees still couldn't find professional work. He'd wanted to be a doctor since childhood, but in 1926, American medical schools were almost entirely closed to black students. Of 77 medical schools in the United States, only 2, Howard University College of Medicine and Meharry Medical College, actively admitted black students. The others had explicit racial exclusions or informal quotas that kept black enrollment near zero. Drew applied to Howard University College of Medicine. He was admitted in 1928. For the next 4 years, he studied medicine while working night jobs to pay tuition. He graduated in 1933 with top honors. Then he faced the next barrier, residency training. Most hospitals didn't accept black residents. The few that did restricted them to colored wards, where they could only treat black patients. Drew wanted to become a surgeon, one of the most competitive specialties, which was essentially closed to black doctors. But Drew had something most applicants didn't, a letter of recommendation from one of his Amherst professors to a colleague at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. McGill's teaching hospital, Montreal General, didn't practice American-style segregation. In 1935, Drew moved to Montreal and began his surgical residency. For the first time in his medical career, he was evaluated purely on skill rather than race. His abilities became immediately apparent. Dr. John Beattie, a British surgeon working at Montreal General, was researching blood storage. The problem fascinated Drew. Every day, patients die from blood loss. Every day, surgeons stood helpless because they couldn't transfuse fast enough. The solution was obvious: store blood so it's available when needed. The problem was that nobody could make it work. Drew approached the problem differently than other researchers. Most were trying to preserve whole blood, keep red cells, white cells, and plasma together in their natural state. Drew wondered, what if you didn't need the whole blood? What if you could separate the components and store them differently? Blood consists of cells suspended in plasma. The cells carry oxygen and fight infection. The plasma, the liquid portion, maintains blood pressure, delivers nutrients, and contains clotting factors. For trauma treatment, you primarily needed the plasma, the volume to maintain blood pressure and prevent shock. And plasma, Drew realized, might be easier to preserve than whole blood. He began experimenting. Drew would separate plasma from blood cells using centrifugation, then test different storage methods: temperature, chemical additives, container materials. He worked obsessively, often through the night, running experiments that other researchers had dismissed as dead ends. In 1938, Drew made his breakthrough.
Plasma could be safely stored for extended periods if kept at specific temperatures with precise chemical preservatives. Not days, not weeks, months. He'd solved the storage problem. He published his findings in 1939 in a medical journal. The implications were revolutionary. Hospitals could now maintain plasma reserves. Trauma patients could receive immediate transfusions without waiting for donors. Surgical complications could be treated instantly. The 60% mortality rate for transfusion-dependent patients could drop dramatically. The medical establishment's response was skeptical. Drew was 35 years old. He was black. He was working at a Canadian hospital, and he was claiming to have solved a problem that had stumped the best researchers in Europe and America. Several prominent hematologists dismissed his work. One review stated, "The author's conclusions exceed what his limited data support. Further research by established institutions will be required to validate these claims." Translation: "We don't believe a black doctor from Canada solved this problem." But one person took Drew seriously. Dr. John Scudder at Columbia University's Presbyterian Hospital in New York. Scudder had been researching blood preservation for years with limited success. He read Drew's paper and recognized genius when he saw it. Scudder invited Drew to Columbia as a research fellow in 1938. Drew accepted, leaving Montreal for New York. Over the next 2 years, he refined his techniques, conducted larger studies, and proved conclusively that plasma storage was safe and effective. In 1940, Drew published his doctoral dissertation, Banked Blood, a study in blood preservation. It was the most comprehensive analysis of blood storage ever conducted. It established the protocols that would become standard practice worldwide. Drew had revolutionized blood medicine. Now he just needed the world to adopt it. Then Germany invaded France, and the world suddenly needed his revolution desperately.
September 1940. London was burning. The German Luftwaffe was conducting nightly bombing raids on British cities. The Blitz, they called it. Hundreds of bombers, dropping thousands of tons of explosives on civilian populations. The casualty toll was staggering. Thousands are injured every night. Hospitals overwhelmed. And they were running out of blood. British doctors faced an impossible situation. More trauma patients than they could treat, and no way to store enough blood for mass casualty events. Patients were dying from treatable injuries because hospitals couldn't transfuse fast enough. The British government approached the American Red Cross with an emergency request. Could America establish a program to collect and ship blood plasma to Britain? The Red Cross said yes. Then they realized they had no idea how to do it. Blood plasma had been Drew's academic research. Nobody had attempted to scale it to industrial production. Nobody had organized mass collection programs. Nobody had solved the logistics of transporting biological materials across the Atlantic. Dr. John Scudder, Drew's mentor at Columbia, recommended one person for the job, Charles Drew. In September 1940, Drew was appointed medical director of the Blood for Britain program. His mission: create a system to collect, process, and ship plasma to Britain fast enough to keep up with casualties. He had 3 months to build something that had never existed. Drew approached it like the surgical problem it was: identify the requirements, design the system, eliminate unnecessary complexity. Requirements: collect blood from donors, separate plasma, preserve it for transport, ship it to Britain,
ensure it arrives usable. Drew's solution was elegant. Create mobile blood collection units that could visit workplaces, community centers, and public gatherings. Process the blood immediately using portable centrifuges. Store the plasma in standardized containers with precise preservative ratios. Ship in refrigerated holds using British cargo vessels already making regular Atlantic crossings. He designed the entire system in 6 weeks. Then he had to convince Americans to donate blood. Blood donation in 1940 was uncommon. Many people believed donating blood weakened you permanently. Religious groups objected on theological grounds. Some doctors still questioned whether transfusion was safe. Drew launched a public campaign. Blood for Britain posters appeared in New York City. Radio announcements explained the need. Newspapers ran stories about British civilians dying from injuries Americans could help treat. The response was extraordinary. Thousands of New Yorkers volunteered to donate blood. Drew's mobile units collected so much blood they had to expand processing facilities twice in the first month. By December 1940, Blood for Britain was shipping 5,000 units of plasma per week across the Atlantic. British hospitals reported dramatic improvements in trauma survival rates. Patients who would have died from shock were being saved with American plasma. Winston Churchill sent a personal letter thanking the American Red Cross. The British press called it a lifeline across the sea. But Drew's success created an unexpected problem. Demand exceeded supply. By January 1941, British hospitals wanted 10,000 units per week. Drew's New York operation couldn't scale that high. The solution was to expand nationally, establish blood collection centers across America, coordinate shipments, standardize procedures. The American Red Cross needed someone to organize a nationwide blood program. In February 1941, they appointed Charles Drew as director of the first American Red Cross Blood Bank and assistant director of blood procurement for the National Research Council. At 37 years old, Drew was now responsible for creating America's entire blood banking infrastructure. He built it in 6 months. Drew established blood collection centers in every major city. He trained thousands of nurses and technicians in collection procedures. He created standardized protocols for processing, storage, and transport. He designed the refrigerated blood bank units that would become standard in hospitals worldwide. By August 1941, the American Red Cross Blood Program was collecting 50,000 units per month and shipping plasma not just to Britain, but to American military bases, preparing for the war everyone knew was coming. Drew had created the modern blood banking system. The infrastructure he designed, mobile collection units, centralized processing, standardized storage, coordinated distribution, is still used today with only minor modifications.
He'd solved the problem nobody else could solve. He'd saved thousands of lives already and would save millions more. Then, the American Red Cross told him they wanted to segregate the blood. The policy came down in late 1941. Blood donations would be accepted from all Americans, but black donors' blood would be labeled and stored separately. It would only be given to black recipients. White patients would receive white donors' blood only. The scientific justification was non-existent. Blood types A, B, AB, O had been discovered in 1901. Compatibility depended on these types, not on race. Drew's own research had proven that plasma was identical across racial groups. There was no biological basis for segregation.
But the Red Cross policy wasn't based on biology. It was based on white Americans' refusal to receive blood from black donors. Southern congressmen had complained to the Red Cross that their constituents wouldn't accept Negro blood. Military officials expressed concern that white soldiers would refuse transfusions if they knew the blood came from black donors. The Red Cross, dependent on government support and public cooperation, capitulated. Charles Drew, the man who'd created the blood banking system, who'd proven that blood was blood regardless of donor race, was told to implement segregation in the program he'd built. His response was immediate and unequivocal. He resigned. In December 1941, Drew left the Red Cross and returned to Howard University as chief surgeon and professor. He would spend the rest of his career training black doctors, performing surgery, and speaking publicly about the scientific fraud of blood segregation. In a 1942 interview, Drew was asked about the Red Cross policy. His response was measured but devastating. The blood of individual human beings may differ by blood groupings, but there is absolutely no scientific basis to indicate any difference in human blood from race to race. The division of blood donors on the basis of race is, from a scientific standpoint, an indefensible practice. Privately, Drew was more blunt. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote, "I created a system to save lives. They turned it into a tool for enforcing racial hierarchy. They took science and corrupted it with prejudice. It's obscene." But Drew's resignation didn't stop blood segregation. The policy he'd opposed became standard practice throughout the military and civilian blood programs. When America entered World War II 1 week after Drew's resignation, following Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the blood banking system he'd created would save hundreds of thousands of American lives. That blood would be segregated until 1950. Black soldiers fighting in the Pacific and Europe would receive blood labeled colored, while white soldiers received blood labeled white, despite the fact that the man who'd invented blood banking had proven this distinction was scientifically meaningless. Military officials justified the policy as preventing problems with morale, meaning white soldiers' prejudice was considered more important than medical science. The irony was bottomless. Drew had created a life-saving technology. America had adopted it enthusiastically. Then America had corrupted it to serve racism over the explicit objections of the man who'd invented it. And Drew, watching from Howard University, could only document the absurdity and hope that eventually science would overcome prejudice. He would not live to see it happen. After resigning from the Red Cross, Charles Drew devoted himself to surgery and medical education at Howard University and Freedman's Hospital. Freedman's Hospital was one of the few institutions in America where black doctors could practice without restrictions. Founded after the Civil War to serve freed slaves, by the 1940s it had become a center of excellence in black medical care, not because black patients needed different medicine, but because segregation forced black doctors and patients into separate institutions. Drew joined Freedman's as chief surgeon in 1942. He was 38 years old, at the peak of his career, with skills that would have made him a star at any hospital in America. But any hospital in America didn't accept black surgeons. So Drew operated at Friedman's, training the next generation of black doctors and building a surgical program that would become legendary in black medical circles and completely unknown to white America. Dr. LaSalle Leffel, who trained under Drew in the late 1940s, described what it was like. Dr. Drew was the finest surgeon I ever observed. His technique was flawless. His judgment was impeccable. He could perform procedures in half the time it took other surgeons, with better outcomes. He should have been operating at Johns Hopkins or Massachusetts General Hospital, teaching thousands of students. Instead, he was at Friedman's, teaching dozens. Not because he wanted to be there, because no other hospital would have him. His skin was the wrong color for American medicine. Drew's typical day started at 6 a.m. with rounds, seeing patients and reviewing cases with residents. Surgery from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., 3, 4, sometimes 5 operations. Then teaching until 9 p.m., lectures on surgical technique, case presentations, demonstrations. He worked 15-hour days, 6 days a week, not because the hospital demanded it, but because he knew his students faced barriers he'd faced, and excellent training was their only weapon against institutional racism. The residents Drew trained had to be better than white doctors just to be considered equal. They had to know more, perform better, work harder, because any mistake would be attributed to their race rather than their individual failings. Drew drilled this into them relentlessly. You must be twice as good to be thought half as worthy, he'd tell students. That's not fair, that's not right, but that's reality, so you will be twice as good. Under Drew's leadership, Friedman's Hospital became known for producing surgeons with exceptional skills. But these surgeons, regardless of their abilities, would face restricted career options upon graduation. They could work at black hospitals. They could open practices in black neighborhoods, but they couldn't get privileges at white hospitals, couldn't join white medical societies, couldn't publish in major medical journals unless a white doctor co-authored. Dr. Burke Syphax, who graduated from Drew's program in 1948, recalled, "I trained under the man who'd invented blood banking. I learned surgical techniques from the finest surgeon in America. Then I graduated and was told I could only operate on colored patients at colored hospitals. My education was equal, my skills were equal, but my opportunities were not." Drew watched his students face these barriers and spoke increasingly publicly about medical segregation. In a 1944 speech to the National Medical Association, the Black Physicians Organization, created because the American Medical Association excluded black doctors, Drew was blunt. "We have a two-tier medical system in America. The white tier has the best facilities, the most resources, the widest opportunities. The colored tier gets whatever's left over. This isn't just unjust, it's medically insane. Disease doesn't respect race. Injuries don't care about skin color. Yet we organize health care as if black bodies and white bodies require fundamentally different treatment." The blood segregation policy exemplifies this insanity. I proved plasma is identical across races. The Red Cross accepted my research, adopted my techniques, then ignored my conclusions about racial differences. This is how racism corrupts everything it touches. Even life-saving medical advances become tools for enforcing hierarchy. Drew's speeches made him controversial. The white medical establishment largely ignored him. Easier to dismiss a black doctor at a black hospital than to engage his arguments. But within black medical circles, Drew became a hero. He was proof that black doctors could achieve the highest levels of excellence, and he was willing to publicly challenge the system that limited them. Meanwhile, Drew continued performing surgeries that showcased his extraordinary skills. In 1946, Drew operated on a patient with a massive abdominal aortic aneurysm, a swelling in the body's largest artery that was almost fatal. The standard procedure, when attempted at all, had a mortality rate over 80%. Drew performed the surgery in 3 hours with a technique he'd developed that minimized bleeding and reduced complications. The patient survived and lived another 15 years. When Drew published the case study, a white surgeon at Johns Hopkins wrote to question whether Drew had actually performed the procedure or whether a white surgeon had assisted. The implication was clear. Surely a black doctor couldn't achieve such results independently. Drew's response, preserved in letters, was icy. "I performed this surgery with black residents assisting. Your suggestion that white assistance was necessary reveals more about your prejudices than about surgical capability. I'd invite you to observe my techniques, but I suspect you'd attribute any success to factors other than my skill." By 1949, Drew had trained over 100 surgeons. Many went on to distinguished careers, despite the barriers they faced. Some became chiefs of surgery at black hospitals across America. Others opened private practices that served black communities with excellent care. They all credited Drew with teaching them not only surgical technique, but how to maintain excellence in a system designed to suppress them. But Drew was exhausted. 15 years of fighting institutional racism while maintaining a demanding surgical practice had worn him down. He was 45 years old and looked 60. Friends urged him to slow down, take a sabbatical, and rest. Drew refused. Too much work to do, too many students to train. In March 1950, Drew was invited to speak at a medical conference at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. Despite his exhaustion, he agreed. He'd drive down with 3 colleagues, deliver his lecture, and drive back. Simple trip.
He left Washington, D.C. on March 31st at 8 p.m., planning to drive through the night to arrive by morning. His colleagues offered to share driving, but Drew insisted he was fine. He wasn't fine. He was exhausted from a week of surgeries and lectures. He was driving on rural southern highways where the only accommodation available to black travelers were a few colored motels scattered hundreds of miles apart. At 2:47 a.m. on April 1, 1950, on Highway 49 in North Carolina, Charles Drew fell asleep at the wheel. The crash should have been survivable, but what happened next would become a legend and a controversy that persists 75 years later. The legend of Charles Drew's death spread through black America within days. The man who invented blood banking died because a white hospital refused to treat him. He bled to death in a segregated waiting room while transfusible blood sat unused in white wards. The inventor of blood medicine was killed by the racism he'd spent his career fighting. The legend was powerful, poetic, a perfect encapsulation of segregation's cruelty.
The genius who saved millions couldn't save himself because of his skin color. The legend was also not entirely accurate, which somehow makes the truth more devastating. Here's what actually happened. At 2:47 a.m., Drew's Buick left Highway 49, rolled multiple times, and came to rest in a ditch. Drew was trapped in the wreckage with catastrophic injuries, crushed chest, severe internal bleeding, probable cardiac trauma. His three passengers, Dr. John Ford, Dr. Walter Johnson, and Dr. Samuel Bullock, were injured but conscious. Ford crawled from the car and flagged down a passing motorist. By 3:10 a.m., a local ambulance arrived. The ambulance took all four doctors to Alamance General Hospital in Burlington, North Carolina, approximately 20 minutes away. They arrived at the hospital around 3:30 a.m. Alamance General was a segregated facility. It had white wards and colored wards with separate entrances. But it also had emergency rooms that treated all patients regardless of race, treating and then transferring to segregated wards. Drew was brought into the emergency room. Dr. Harold Kernodle, a white surgeon on duty, immediately assessed his injuries and recognized they were catastrophic. He had severe chest trauma, was hemorrhaging internally, and was going into shock. Dr. Kernodle began emergency treatment. Fluids were administered. Blood pressure was monitored. The chest injuries were assessed for possible surgery. But Drew's injuries were too severe. His chest had been crushed in the crash. His heart and major blood vessels were damaged beyond what 1950 surgery could repair. Even at the best hospital in America, with a full trauma team, Drew's survival would have been unlikely. At Alamance General, with limited staff at 3:30 a.m. and injuries that exceeded medical capability of the era, Drew's chances were essentially zero. He died at approximately 4:15 a.m., 45 minutes after arriving at the hospital. Dr. Kernodle would later state, "We did everything we could. His injuries were too severe. Even if we'd had unlimited blood, which we did, it wouldn't have saved him. The damage was too extensive." The other three doctors, Ford, Johnson, and Bullock, survived with treatable injuries. They were treated in the emergency room, then transferred to the colored ward for overnight observation. All three confirmed that Drew received treatment, that doctors tried to save him, that he wasn't refused care because of his race. So the legend that he bled to death untreated was false. But the truth is still damning. Because while Drew technically received treatment, the quality and intensity of that treatment was limited by segregation in ways both obvious and subtle. Alamance General's colored ward had fewer resources than the white ward. The best equipment was allocated to white patients. The most experienced staff worked white wards. Emergency resources were divided unequally. Had Drew been white, would he have been treated differently? Would more resources have been mobilized faster? Would different decisions have been made? We can't know. His injuries were likely fatal regardless, but the structural inequality of segregated medicine meant that black patients, even famous black doctors, entered hospitals with systemic disadvantages. And there's a deeper irony. The blood available at Alamance General in 1950 was stored using Drew's techniques, in facilities designed according to his specifications, administered through protocols he'd established. The life-saving system he had created was available. It just couldn't save him. Not because of the system's limitations, but because his injuries exceeded what 1950 medicine could treat. When news of Drew's death reached Washington, D.C. and New York, the black medical community was devastated. The white medical establishment issued brief, formal condolences. The Red Cross released a statement praising Drew's contributions to blood banking, without mentioning that he'd resigned in protest of their segregation policy.
But in black communities across America, the legend version of Drew's death began spreading. He'd been refused treatment. He'd died in a colored waiting room. White doctors had let him bleed out. The legend wasn't true, but it felt true. It captured a larger truth about segregated medicine, that black patients died from inadequate care every day, that segregation killed through systematic inequality, even when individual doctors tried their best, that racism was so endemic that America would let its medical geniuses die rather than truly integrate health care. Drew's colleagues, the 3 doctors who survived the crash, tried to correct the legend. They published statements saying Drew had received treatment, that the white doctors had tried to save him, that his death wasn't from refusal of care. But the legend persisted, because the legend served a purpose. It made racism visible in a way that structural inequality often isn't. It gave people a story they could understand and be outraged by. The truth that Drew died from injuries sustained while driving exhausted through the night because segregation limited his accommodation options, that he received technically adequate care but structurally unequal, that the system he'd revolutionized couldn't save him partly because of the racism he'd fought against, was more complex and somehow more damning than the legend. At Drew's funeral on April 5, 1950, over 5,000 people attended. Black doctors from across America, his students, his patients, peoples whose lives he'd saved through his blood banking work. The white medical establishment sent flowers and formal regrets. The American Red Cross sent a wreath. The blood banks Drew had created operated normally that day, saving lives with systems he'd designed. Dr. LaSalle Lafall, Drew's student, delivered a eulogy. Dr. Drew taught us that excellence was the only response to racism, that we had to be so good, so undeniably competent, that prejudice would be exposed as the lie it is. He lived that teaching every day of his life. He created blood banking. He saved millions of lives. He trained hundreds of surgeons. He proved that black doctors could achieve the highest levels of medical excellence. And then he died in a segregated healthcare system that never fully acknowledged his genius because of his skin color. That's the tragedy. Not how he died, but that he had to fight racism every single day of his brilliant career. That his achievements were always qualified by his race. That America took his inventions and then tried to pretend a black man hadn't created them. After Charles Drew's death, something remarkable happened. America tried to forget he existed. Medical history books published in the 1950s and 60s discussed blood banking, but often didn't mention Drew. When he was mentioned, it was briefly, as a contributor to blood banking research, not as the inventor of the system. Some historians credited John Scudder, Drew's mentor, as the primary developer of plasma storage. Others attributed blood banking to American and British researchers collectively, erasing individual achievement to avoid acknowledging black genius. The erasure was systematic.
Medical schools didn't teach about Drew. History books didn't include him. When discussing World War II medical advances, educators mentioned penicillin and sulfa drugs, but skipped the blood banking that saved as many lives as antibiotics. Why the erasure? Because acknowledging Drew required acknowledging uncomfortable truths, that a black doctor had solved a problem white researchers couldn't, that American medicine had been built on segregation that suppressed black talent, and that one of the most important medical advances of the 20th century came from someone the American medical establishment had tried to exclude. Easier to forget Drew than to confront those truths. But black communities remembered Drew. Black doctors taught their students about Drew. Black medical schools kept his story alive. The National Medical Association, the Black Physicians Organization, established the Charles R. Drew Memorial Lecture Series in 1951. And slowly, over decades, Drew's story began reaching wider audiences. In 1968, during the Civil Rights Movement, activists pointed to Drew as an example of suppressed black achievement. How many other black geniuses, they asked, had been erased from history? How much human potential had segregation wasted? In 1977, the Charles Drew University of Medicine and Science was established in Los Angeles, a historically black medical school named in his honor. In 1981, the U.S. Postal Service issued a Charles Drew stamp, recognition that he'd achieved something worthy of national commemoration. In 1996, Amherst College, Drew's alma mater, established the Charles Drew House as a cultural center focused on African American life and history. The reclamation was incomplete and slow. Drew still isn't as widely known as he should be. Many Americans have never heard of him. Medical students might get one lecture on his contributions, but compared to the active erasure of the 1950s to 70s, it was progress. But in black communities across America, the legend version of Drew's death began spreading. He'd been refused treatment. He'd died in a colored waiting room. White doctors had let him bleed out. The legend wasn't true, but it felt true. It captured a larger truth about segregated medicine, that black patients died from inadequate care every day, that segregation killed through systematic inequality, even when individual doctors tried their best, that racism was so endemic that America would let its medical geniuses die rather than truly integrate health care. Drew's colleagues, the 3 doctors who survived the crash, tried to correct the legend. They published statements saying Drew had received treatment, that the white doctors had tried to save him, that his death wasn't from refusal of care. But the legend persisted, because the legend served a purpose. It made racism visible in a way that structural inequality often isn't. It gave people a story they could understand and be outraged by. The truth that Drew died from injuries sustained while driving exhausted through the night because segregation limited his accommodation options, that he received technically adequate care but structurally unequal, that the system he'd revolutionized couldn't save him partly because of the racism he'd fought against, was more complex and somehow more damning than the legend. At Drew's funeral on April 5, 1950, over 5,000 people attended. Black doctors from across America, his students, his patients, peoples whose lives he'd saved through his blood banking work. The white medical establishment sent flowers and formal regrets. The American Red Cross sent a wreath. The blood banks Drew had created operated normally that day, saving lives with systems he'd designed. Dr. LaSalle Lafall, Drew's student, delivered a eulogy. Dr. Drew taught us that excellence was the only response to racism. That we had to be so good, so undeniably competent, that prejudice would be exposed as the lie it is. He lived that teaching every day of his life. He created blood banking. He saved millions of lives. He trained hundreds of surgeons. He proved that black doctors could achieve the highest levels of medical excellence. And then he died in a segregated healthcare system that never fully acknowledged his genius because of his skin color. That's the tragedy. Not how he died, but that he had to fight racism every single day of his brilliant career. That his achievements were always qualified by his race. That America took his inventions and then tried to pretend a black man hadn't created them. After Charles Drew's death, something remarkable happened. America tried to forget he existed. Medical history books published in the 1950s and 60s discussed blood banking, but often didn't mention Drew. When he was mentioned, it was briefly, as a contributor to blood banking research, not as the inventor of the system. Some historians credited John Scudder, Drew's mentor, as the primary developer of plasma storage. Others attributed blood banking to American and British researchers collectively, erasing individual achievement to avoid acknowledging black genius. The erasure was systematic. Medical schools didn't teach about Drew. History books didn't include him. When discussing World War II medical advances, educators mentioned penicillin and sulfa drugs, but skipped the blood banking that saved as many lives as antibiotics. Why the erasure? Because acknowledging Drew required acknowledging uncomfortable truths, that a black doctor had solved a problem white researchers couldn't. That American medicine had been built on segregation that suppressed black talent, and that one of the most important medical advances of the 20th century came from someone the American medical establishment had tried to exclude. Easier to forget Drew than to confront those truths. But black communities remembered Drew. Black doctors taught their students about Drew. Black medical schools kept his story alive. The National Medical Association, the Black Physicians Organization, established the Charles R. Drew Memorial Lecture Series in 1951. And slowly, over decades, Drew's story began reaching wider audiences. In 1968, during the Civil Rights Movement, activists pointed to Drew as an example of suppressed black achievement. How many other black geniuses, they asked, had been erased from history? How much human potential had segregation wasted? In 1977, the Charles Drew University of Medicine and Science was established in Los Angeles, a historically black medical school named in his honor. In 1981, the U.S. Postal Service issued a Charles Drew stamp, recognition that he'd achieved something worthy of national commemoration. In 1996, Amherst College, Drew's alma mater, established the Charles Drew House as a cultural center focused on African American life and history. The reclamation was incomplete and slow. Drew still isn't as widely known as he should be. Many Americans have never heard of him. Medical students might get one lecture on his contributions. but compared to the active erasure of the 1950s to 70s, it was progress.
And the legend of his death, the story that he'd been refused treatment, proved nearly impossible to correct. Even after his colleagues published detailed accounts of what actually happened, even after historians documented the truth, the legend persisted. Because the legend, while factually inaccurate, was emotionally true. It captured the reality of segregated medicine, that black patients received inferior care, that racism killed through systematic inequality, that Drew's genius couldn't protect him from the racism he'd fought his entire career. In 2000, on the 50th anniversary of Drew's death, Howard University held a symposium examining his legacy. Speakers included doctors he'd trained, historians who'd studied his work, and medical ethicists who analyzed blood segregation's scientific fraud. One speaker, Dr. W. Montague Cobb, who'd been Drew's colleague at Howard, summarized Drew's impact. Charles Drew invented the blood banking system that saves 20 million lives per year globally. That's his quantifiable achievement. But his larger legacy is proving that scientific genius transcends race. He demonstrated excellence at the highest level while fighting racism every day, and he did it with dignity that shamed those who doubted him. The tragedy isn't just that he died young. It's that America wasted so much of his potential by forcing him to fight barriers that shouldn't have existed. Imagine what else he could have achieved if he'd had the opportunities white doctors took for granted. Today, Charles Drew's blood banking system, only slightly modified from his original design, operates worldwide. Blood banks exist in every developed nation. Mobile collection units visit communities daily. Standardized storage procedures ensure safety. Coordinated distribution networks save millions of lives annually. Drew created all of this by age 36. He died at 45, having spent the last 8 years of his life training black doctors at a segregated hospital because America wouldn't let him work elsewhere. The waste is staggering, the injustice is profound, and the question persists. How many other black geniuses did America suppress through segregation? How many medical advances, scientific breakthroughs, and technological innovations were lost because talent was denied opportunity? We'll never know, but Drew's story provides a glimpse of what was possible when exceptional ability broke through systemic barriers, and what was lost when those barriers closed again. On January 1, 1950, the American Red Cross quietly ended its policy of segregating blood donations. No announcement, no explanation, no acknowledgement that the policy had been scientifically fraudulent from its inception. Charles Drew died 3 months later, never knowing that the policy he'd resigned in protest of had finally been abandoned. The military continued segregating blood until July 1950, 3 months after Drew's death. The change came not from moral awakening, but from pragmatic calculation. Maintaining separate blood supplies for white and black soldiers was logistically complicated and medically unnecessary. Everything Drew had said in 1941, that blood segregation had no scientific basis, was finally accepted in 1950, 9 years later, after millions of pints had been needlessly labeled and segregated, after the man who'd proven it was wrong had died. Today, blood banks don't ask about the donor race. Blood types matter. Race doesn't. The scientific truth Drew proved in 1939 is universally accepted. But it took America 11 years to acknowledge what he demonstrated immediately. The modern blood banking system saves 40,000 lives per day in the United States alone, 15 million lives per year globally. Since Drew invented the system in 1938, his work has saved an estimated 1.5 billion lives worldwide. That's not hyperbole. That's a documented impact. Drew's innovation enabled trauma medicine, cancer treatment, surgical procedures, childbirth safety, and emergency medicine that simply couldn't exist without reliable blood supplies. He's arguably saved more lives than any single person in human history, and most people have never heard of him. In 2010, a major medical journal ran a retrospective on the greatest medical advances of the 20th century. Blood banking was listed in the top 5. Charles Drew's name appeared in a subordinate clause, included among unnamed researchers, as if his contribution was equivalent to assistants running experiments, rather than the genius who conceived the entire system. The erasure continues in subtle ways, not active suppression anymore, just passive forgetting. The comfortable assumption that important medical advances came from the usual sources, white researchers at elite institutions, rather than from a black doctor working at Howard University. But the blood remains, in banks, in hospitals, in ambulances, stored using Drew's protocols, distributed through systems he designed, saving lives every minute of every day. The evidence of his genius is in every transfusion, every surgery, every emergency room, every battlefield, every disaster response. The blood he made storable doesn't care about race, doesn't care about the segregation that tried to divide it, doesn't care about the erasure that tried to hide its inventor. It just saves lives, all lives, without distinction, which is exactly what Charles Drew proved it should do. He died 75 years ago. His system has saved 1.5 billion lives since then, and it will save 15 million more this year. That's the legacy they couldn't erase, no matter how hard they tried.